Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, Market Enhancements for Summer 2021 Readiness. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. To enter the queue to ask a question, you will press #2 on your telephone keypad. To submit a written question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and press send. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. With that, I'll turn the call over to Radha Madrigal. Radha, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diana. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Radha Madrigal, and I'll be taking you through today's session. I am joined virtually by some of my colleagues who may speak up during Q&A or to provide clarity when needed as we discuss this topic. Let's pause briefly here to have my panelists introduce themselves. James, if you'd go first.
Good morning. This is James Friedrich. I'm with the Market Design Policy Group, and I helped design the policy for this topic. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. And then Greg?
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Ford with the IT group, and I was involved with the design of the cyber rules that are associated with this project.
Wonderful, thanks. So those are the folks that we have to join us today to help me answer questions during this session. We're here to talk about the changes being implemented as part of the market enhancements for summer 2021 readiness. In an effort to increase transparency and provide greater service to our stakeholders, we are recording this webinar. It will be posted on our website so that you can review it in the future, and for those who were not able to join today's call. The slides for today's session have been posted on CAISA.com and can be found in the Learning Center under New Modules, on the Release Planning page under the Summer 2021 Release heading, and on the Stakeholder Initiative page under Market Enhancements for Summer 2021 Readiness. We will be taking questions throughout this session. We will take verbal questions and also questions in the chat. If you want to ask a question, you can make sure that you chat to everyone so that all participants are able to see your questions. And if you want to ask a verbal question, you can virtually raise your hand by pressing #2 on your keypad. This is the third training session for the Market Enhancements for Summer 2021 Readiness Initiative. The focus of today's session is the changes made to load, export, and wheeling through priorities. These changes were made to equitably balance the reliability of serving ISO Balancing Authority area load with the reliability of exports while providing open access to the ISO transmission system. We're going to cover a number of topics in this session. First, we'll talk about how exports cleared in day ahead are prioritized relative to ISO load in real time. We'll talk about the requirements for designating non-RA capacity that's backing those high priority export schedules. We'll discuss how outages are applied to partial RA resources that might back the high priority export. We'll go through a discussion about market prioritization of wheel-through self-schedules, and we'll have a brief discussion about how transmission is allocated if the ISO's hour-ahead scheduling process is infeasible. The changes that we're making to market scheduling priorities for exports and wheel-through self-schedules relative to ISO load, we'll talk about that next. So we're going to be changing how exports cleared in the day-ahead ROK process are prioritized relative to ISO load in the real-time market. We're going to talk about the enhancing requirements for designating non-RA capacity, backing high-priority export schedules, and the discussion about changing market prioritization of wheel-through self-schedules. I wanted to remind folks that the changes that we're making to prioritization only comes into effect when tight system conditions occur and we need to cut self-schedules. In most cases, all self-schedules are honored. This prioritization only comes into effect when we are experiencing tight system conditions and the market needs to determine where to make cuts. The focus of this session here is on the changes that we're implementing for exports, load, and wheeling. So these next few slides discuss the priority of those items. But I want to recognize that the lists I've created don't include every item that has priority. For example, RMR, TOR, ETC, those are all items that have priority, but we are not making any changes to their ranking, so they don't appear on this list. If you want to take a look at the complete list of priority ranking, you can find that in the document link at the bottom of the slide. I also want to double check something. I feel like we might have skipped a slide, so if you pause for just a moment here while I take a look at where we are. Okay, yeah, something kind of happened and it seemed to have skipped forward here. So let me take a step back. I'm not quite sure how that happened. We seem to have just jumped forward a few. So I'm going to roll this back real fast here. We've got the agenda where we talked about the topics that we're going to be discussing today. I don't remember seeing this acronym slide, so I think we kind of jumped forward about 10 slides. It felt a little fast. So back to the beginning here, there's a couple of acronyms that we're going to be going through in today's session. You'll see those throughout the slide presentation, and here are additional acronyms as well. If you want to follow along with slides posted on Kaisa.com, you can also refer back to these pages when we're going through the discussion. Now, to kick this off, I have divided this training into a couple of sections. First, we're going to talk about the overall changes at a high level to provide context and some background, especially for folks who haven't been closely following this topic. And then we're going to discuss implementation details, which will include specific changes at the application level. So we'll touch on things such as what the new master file fields are and what you'll be expected to do from a bidding perspective. And then finally, we'll close with some information about market simulation for this effort. All right. Beginning with the implementation timeline, we filed these tariff changes with FERC on April 28th. We've requested that they issue an order on the filing by June 27th. At this time, market simulation will be occurring from June 30th to July 6th. With this tariff filing, there are a couple of different effective dates. First, with regard to priority wheeling through, that will be effective June 28th, 2021, and will be in place for a temporary time period. Those changes will then sunset on May 31st of 2022. We are kicking off a new initiative for the external load forward scheduling rights process on July 13th. Details about that meeting are posted to the ISO calendar. This particular initiative will explore the development of a process for wheeling through transactions to obtain higher priority scheduling rights across the ISO system, particularly during high load periods and stressed system conditions. In addition, the initiative will evaluate potential enhancements regarding the treatment of export transactions from non-RA generation. So that meeting is going to kick off in a couple of weeks. And with regard to the additional load, export, and wheeling through revisions, those changes will be effective no later than July 15th. We plan to notify market participants at least 5 days in advance before we implement that. So the earliest date these changes would be effective with that 5 days notice would be July 3rd, assuming that FERC issues an order on June 27th, and then we turn around and issue a notice on June 28th. So look for that notice on CAISO.com, or if you subscribe to our daily briefing emails, you'll see it there. All right, so now we're going to dive into the background of the high-level review of changes. We've seen this slide here. Again, we're making changes to prioritization, and those changes only come into effect when those tight system conditions occur, and we would need to cut self-schedules. In most cases, those self-schedules are honored. So I just wanted you to keep that in mind as we're discussing that. With these changes, we will no longer prioritize exports that are deemed feasible in ROK over serving ISO load. And a little bit of background on that, the ROK process does not prevent RA capacity that's needed to serve ISO load in real time from being used to support an export that cleared in day ahead. So the way ROK clears is that it clears loads and exports. And exports need to designate an available resource, but the market does not require that the designated resource receive an IFM or ROK award in order to clear that export. Now, all exports that clear ROK get high priority status, but those high priority exports are not actually unit contingent. Therefore, there is this possibility that RA resource capacity is being used to support those export schedules, because we look at that RA capacity first when we are clearing the ROK process. So we're going to be enforcing two classes of export schedules all the way through the real-time market. Exports backed by capacity designated to serve external load will have a higher priority, which is the same as ISO load. And then those exports that are not backed by this capacity that's designated to serve external load will get a lower scheduling priority than ISO load. We're also going to be enhancing rules specifying non-RA capacity to back these high priority exports. We'll be implementing a master file flag that will identify these resources that can be designated to support the high priority exports. Today in cyber, we validate that a designated resource has non-RA capacity available to support the export, but this new master file flag will add an additional requirement to attest that this resource meets specific criteria. And we'll go over those details when we get to the implementation section and we talk about the master file changes. These resources that are identified as supporting high priority exports must confirm that they have a load serving entity outside of the ISO with a right to that capacity. And the resource will be notified if designated to support a high priority export to ensure that it can meet its obligations. This notification will occur in cyber based on validation rules. And the notification is based on when the bids are submitted by the resource and by the export. So right before the close of the day-ahead market at 10 a.m. would be the latest that you would get this notification. So it depends on when each side of that transaction is submitting the bid as to when you would receive that notification. A variable energy resource can be designated to back a high priority export if their export quantity is no greater than the lowest 15-minute forecasted output for the hour. We're also going to clarify how outages are applied to partial RA resources that might be backing these high priority exports. So if a scheduling coordinator notifies the ISO of a contract term that specifies how these outages are applied to both the RA and the non-RA portion of the capacity, those terms will be reflected in that outage distribution. This notification that we're talking about occurs in CIRA, the Customer Interface for Resource Adequacy. We will be implementing a new screen for this purpose, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment. If there is no specification, then the ISO will apply a pro rata distribution of the outage against the RA and the non-RA capacity. We're also going to be changing the prioritization of wheel-through self-schedules. Today, these wheel-through self-schedules cleared in the ROK process have a higher scheduling priority than imports or internal generation needed to serve ISO load. These wheel-throughs consist of balanced import and export legs, and wheel-throughs can use transmission capacity that is needed by RA supply to serve ISO load. So we're making changes to the priorities so that these high priority wheels have the same priority as serving load with self-scheduled supply. And in a couple of slides, we'll revisit the topic of priority. I think we got a little bit of a preview on that when the slide deck kind of jumped from slide 3 to 16 or whatever it was. So we'll see that slide in just a moment. We're also going to be differentiating high priority and low priority wheels. High priority wheels are available for external load serving entities that are planning on using the ISO system to meet their reliability needs. You can establish these high priority wheels by notifying the ISO 45 days prior to the month of the megawatt quantity of the wheel. This notification process involves completing a new intertie resource request form, and we'll go over that process in a few minutes. In addition to this notification, 45 days in advance of the month, there's also an attestation that you have secured firm transmission to the ISO border for the entire month. And as I mentioned earlier, these were the provisions that will be sunsetting on May 31st of 2022. All right, now we're back to this slide that we saw just a few minutes ago. The focus of today's session is going to be on the changes that we're implementing for exports, loads, and wheeling. So these next couple of slides that I'm going to show you discuss the priority for those items, but I also want to point out that these lists that I've created don't include every item that has priority. For example, RMR, TOR, ETC, those are all items that have priority, but we are not making any changes to their ranking, so they don't appear on this list. If you would like to take a look at the complete list of priority rankings, you can find that in the document link at the bottom of this slide here. So when we're talking about comparing day-ahead self-scheduled priority levels, we're going to talk about it from two perspectives, demand-side priorities and supply-side priorities. When we're determining what needs to be cut, from the demand side perspective, that means we have too much demand, so the priority levels associated with that. The export self-schedule of a priority wheel has the same priority as ISO load, which also has the same priority as a high priority export. And then a lower priority would be the low priority export or the export self-schedule of a non-priority wheel. Now, on the supply side, self-scheduled supply, which could be internal generation or imports, have the same level priority as an import self-schedule of a priority wheel. And then lower than that would be the import self-schedule of a non-priority wheel. From the real-time perspective, we'll first take a look at, again, the demand-side priorities. We have too much demand. We need to figure out what needs to be cut. Demand side values are going to be positive values, and supply side are going to be negative values. From the demand side perspective, there's ISO load, which has the same priority as the export self-schedule of a priority wheel, which has the same priority as a high priority export that clears ROK, and the designated resource provides real-time bids to cover that full export award. And all of these have the same priority as an export with a designated resource that submits bids above their ROK schedule. Lower than that would be the day-ahead low-priority export, which has the same priority as a day-ahead high-priority export, where that designated resource does not provide those real-time bids to cover that full ROK award. And then below that would be the real-time low-priority export. Now, there's a caveat that goes along with that, and that is that these dispatch priorities, as defined by the real-time market optimization, may be superseded by ISO operator actions and procedures as necessary to ensure reliable operations of the grid. On the supply side, ROK self-scheduled supply, which could be internal or an import, has the same priority level as the import leg of a high priority wheel that cleared ROK. Lower than that would be a real-time self-scheduled supply, import leg of a real-time high priority wheel, and then lower than that would be import self-schedule of a non-priority wheel through, which would be day ahead or real-time. And again, that same caveat applies with regard to ISO operator action. And then finally, we have a new process to equitably allocate transmission if the ISO's hour-ahead scheduling process is infeasible. So there would be a pro rata allocation between RA supply bidding into HASP and high priority wheels bidding into HASP. The wheel quantity will be limited by the day-ahead schedule. There will be a pro rata allocation that is applied to binding intertie constraints and binding constraints on Path 26. And again, operator judgment ultimately determines what schedules are supported. So a little bit more on this process. This process would occur if we are short of supply in HASP and therefore HASP is infeasible. And if we have any intertie or if Path 26 is binding, in that situation we would go to this pro rata allocation. So when we say that an intertie is binding, what we're saying is that there's no more energy that can flow across that tie. So for example, let's say we have a HASP schedule of 2,000 megawatts, but the supply is only 1,900 megawatts. So if there's one binding intertie or if Path 26 is binding, then this pro rata allocation will be applied. So that is a high-level discussion of the process. Next, we're going to discuss implementation details which have, application-specific discussions, but we've gone through a number of slides here, so I wanted to take a pause here for our first set of questions to see if anyone has any questions about what we've covered so far, either questions verbally or in the chat. So I'll pause for a moment.
As we move to Q&A, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a verbal question. To submit a written question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and press send.
Diana, do we have anyone in the verbal question queue?
There are no people in the verbal question queue.
All right, and I'm not seeing any notes in the chat, so I'll move on to the implementation section here. Now, in the implementation section, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to discuss master file data. We're going to discuss management of outages on partial RA resources and cyber bidding and validation rules. Now, I see that there's a couple questions in the chat coming, so let me scroll up here and see what we've got going on. All right, so there's a question from Phil. How should we handle stranded loads in the event that a transmission outage requires an export to serve CAISO load? That load is CAISO load that needs the export to serve it. Okay, so James, do you have an answer to that question?
This is James. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not 100% sure what this question is getting at, but I'd be happy to discuss further with the commenter. I'll leave my email in the chat so he can follow up with me.
Okay, thanks. So Phil, if you would reach out to James, that would be great on that. And there's a question. I see a question from Dan that was sent to presenters. It says, on June 17th, due to the high confidence ROK procurement target, there was a ROK undersupply in feasibility during peak demand hours, and approximately 300 to 400 megawatts of non-RA backed high priority exports were reduced in ROK alongside CAISO demand. Under this new policy, would the same outcome occur whenever the CAISO has a ROK undersupply in feasibility?
This is James. I don't see the question in the chat, so I'm not sure I got every detail. But it sounds like, go ahead and repeat it so I can.
Yeah, so Cindy, if you wouldn't mind, if you could take Dan's question and post that in the chat to everyone, that way James can see it as well. And then while you're doing that, I'll reread it. We're talking about June 17th, so last week. Due to high confidence ROK procurement target, we had a ROK undersupply in feasibility during peak demand hours, and approximately 300 to 400 megawatts of non-RA backed high priority exports were reduced in ROK alongside CAISO demand. And he's wondering, under this new policy, would the same outcome occur whenever the CAISO has a ROK undersupply in feasibility?
Okay, so I see the question now. Thanks, Dan. So non-RA resource-backed high priority export. I'm not sure why a non-RA resource-backed. Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I misread the question. I think the answer is it depends sort of on market. On the market optimization, I don't think that we should expect any sort of pro rata cut to ISO load or high priority exports in the case where ROK is infeasible. I think it's just going to depend on the workings of the market and, of course, any potential operator judgment that's needed in there. So it's kind of hard to say how that might be replicated, but it seems like if those exports continue to be high priority as defined in our new policy, that it's likely that there may be other types of exports that would be cut first. Low priority exports hopefully be cut first before looking at high priority exports and ISO load. I hope that answers your question, Dan, and if not, you can reach out to me.
Okay, thank you for that, James. So we're going to dive into the implementation details now, first with discussion about master file data. So we've added some new fields to master file to support export and PT wheeling scheduling priorities. And there's also a process to register a new PT wheel resource ID using the new intertie resource request form. So let's take a look at those changes here. Are we on the right slide? Yes, okay. New process for identifying resources that can support a PT wheel. PT stands for price taker, by the way. There is a new master file flags that will identify export system resources that can support these schedules. This will default to null. 2 fields have been added, price taker wheel schedule and price taker wheel megawatt. And we'll take a look at the IRDT in a couple of slides, the intertie resource data template. The PT wheel schedule is a yes field or not applicable, and the PT wheel megawatt field is where you would indicate the megawatt quantity of the wheel as a single quantity. The scheduling coordinator must request a PT wheel ID in order to activate these fields, or they would designate an existing export resource ID by populating those fields in the IRDT. SDs can define a wheel schedule as a high priority wheel by creating this new export system resource that will be designated through the use of these master file flags as capable of supporting a PT wheel. And what we mean by that is essentially meeting all of the attestation criteria, which I have listed on the next slide here, so let's go to that. By submitting these PT wheel flags, the SD is attesting that they meet the criteria. PT wheel supported by a firm supply contract to serve load in another BAA outside of the ISO for the month. And the PT wheel is supported by a monthly firm transmission from source to CAISO's scheduling point for hour ending 7 through 22, Monday through Friday, excluding NERC holidays. This notification occurs with this 45-day ahead submission of the new intertie resource request form if you're creating a new export resource or updating these fields on an existing export resource. So the new intertie resource request form, if you need to schedule or set up a new export resource, you can find that form on the network and resource modeling page following the navigation path that's listed on this slide. That would be to register a high priority wheel. You would complete this new intertie resource request form and send it to rdt@CAISO.com. From a timing perspective, for the months of July and August, we need to get those forms in by June 29th. That is next Tuesday. We sent out a notice a couple of days ago as a reminder about that as well with a discussion of the process. Requests for subsequent months are due 45 days prior to the month. Here is the new intertie resource request form that I showed you, where you can find it on the network and modeling page. The instructions tab for this form have all the information you need to complete it. You can see those 2 fields on here, PT wheel schedule, which is yes or NA, and PT wheel megawatts. And then the intertie resource data template. If you are not setting up a new export resource, you already have one, and you just want to add these fields to that export resource ID, then you would update those on the IRDT, the intertie resource data template. So you're either filling out a new form to get a new export resource ID, or you're adding these flags to an already existing export resource ID using the intertie resource data template. With regard to resources that can support a PT export, we have a new master file flag that will identify ISO internal supply resources that can support these PT exports. Again, this field will also default to null. The field export support has been added to the GRDT, the generator resource data template. Cyber will receive this master file flag that identifies whether the resource can or cannot potentially support a self-scheduled export. By submitting these flags for the designated resource, the SD can confirm a number of things. Number one, the resource is capable at the time of bid submission of supporting an hourly block schedule over the entire relevant operating hour equal to that PT export quantity. that a variable energy resource can support the export quantity in all of the 15-minute intervals across that time period, and that the designated capacity has been forward contracted only with an external load-serving entity. And we'll take a look at the GRDT now. So you can see that field that was added there to the last column. There's a lot, columns A through, we're all the way at CW now. Export capable, which is a yes or not applicable. SCs who wish to indicate a designated resource to support export self-schedules at scheduling points backed by non-RA capacity may do so by submitting this updated GRDT with the export support column set to yes. With regard to timing of these master file changes, updates are subject to the master file 5 business day timeline. So due to the timing of the FERC decision on the tariff provisions, which is expected by June 27th, 2021, SCs should send an email to rdt@CAISO.com if they want to request an expedited effective date. Any questions here about the new master file changes?
As a reminder, dialing #2 on your telephone keypad will enter you into the verbal question queue. And we do have a verbal question. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Noah Tong from Middle River Power. Just a quick question, if you could help. When does the ISO system sort of differentiate between TT through the day-ahead market versus TT through the ROK award? And what causes ROK to clear an export as TT if it were potentially not cleared in the day-ahead award?
Okay, thanks for your question, Noah. We have a couple of examples about bidding and cyber validation rules coming up in 2 sections. So we'll give you some discussion and examples on that, and then if that doesn't answer that question fully, please reach out again. But we're going to talk about outages next, and then we'll get into cyber and validation rules and kind of how that priority or low priority export gets designated and when.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yep, sure thing. Any other questions on the line, Diana?
No, there are no more verbal questions.
All right, and I see there was a question in the chat, and it looks like James answered that, so thank you, James. We're going to move forward with discussion of outages here. So we've added some functionality to SIRA to help with this piece of it, the calculation of how outages impact both the RA and the non-RA capacity on a supporting resource. The SC of a supporting resource shall notify the ISO using SIRA, the customer interface for resource adequacy, if their RA capacity changes. Otherwise, we will, in order to account for those outages, we will pro rata allocate the outage megawatts between the RA capacity and the remainder of the resource's capacity up to its Pmax. So we have a new screen in SIRA for this purpose. Off of the substitutions menu, you'll enter your RA curtailment megawatts for those PT export support resources in that new screen called PT export resource. Essentially what you would do is select the outage ID from the top of the list, and it's going to populate information in the bottom grid where you can enter curtailment. So you will enter your RA curtailment megawatts, and then the SIRA application will automatically populate the next column, which is the non-RA curtailment megawatt column, once you've actually entered those curtailment megawatts. Now, I do also want to note for you here that you can use these substitution screens to provide these breakdowns indirectly by providing those substitutions as well. Any questions about CIRA before we move into cyber and the bidding validation? Question, how does this screen manage this on an hourly basis? Let me go back to this screen. Now, I haven't looked at that specifically. So the outages are for a specific time period. So my expectation would be that it would apply during the time period of the outage, but I want to just double check that with the team to make sure that that's accurate. So I'm going to take a note to investigate that. And I get, as part of this webinar, I get an email, or I get a list of everyone's email addresses who've logged in, so I can send that answer out to you all who are in on today's call.
We do have a verbal question in the queue.
Okay.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Noah from Middle River Power. Just as a follow-up to the written question, mainly, there's two pieces. You have the start time, end time, even if it's within the same day, particularly if it has potentially, ambient D rates. The ambient D rate could be on an hourly basis. So trying to understand or better understand how we could allocate the D rates or should we allocate the D rates on an hourly basis, or does the system sort of just look at the maximum amount of D rate that will be impacted and then apply it using that type of ratio to apply to that? And then secondly, it also looks like there are two potentially overlapping outages. In that case, how would we manage the overlapping outage section?
All right, I will see if I can get that level of detail for you. Absolutely.
Yeah, and thank you. And then I guess once we get to the cyber bidding side, how it would be helpful to sort of better understand how the outages may impact the supporting resources quantity when it clears cyber. Thanks.
Yeah, sure thing. There was another question in the chat that said, when will we see this new feature in CIRA? I know that they are working on these screens. I am not 100% sure when that is going to be rolled out into production. We can possibly move that discussion to the Market Sim activity. I'm imagining that you will be seeing these in Market Sim when they roll that out to that environment. And I believe that this will then coincide with, we had said some of these changes will be implemented no later than July 15th. So I'm imagining that that's the time frame. Again, I think you'll get a little bit more clarity as you go through Market Sim and we actually roll this out into production. I don't have my finger on the pulse of how that is working. There was also another question about if this new screen is available as an API. I'm not sure, but I can find out the answer to that and send that out in the email follow-up as well. All right. Moving on to the cyber bidding and validation rules section. There's a couple of terms that we're going to be using. I'm not going to read these out to you at a high level or word by word, I should say, but we're going to be talking about PT exports and LPT exports. PT, again, in this context stands for price taker. So we're talking about self-schedules in this situation. PT exports have a designated resource associated with them, and LPT exports, which is a lower priority have no identified resource. And then there's the price taker and non-price taker wheels that meet a certain criteria for high priority and then a lower priority of that. So we're talking about exports and wheels. And from a bidding perspective, when you are looking in the cyber application, you'll be bidding into PT export or LPT export. And then later, and there was kind of a question that alluded to this, later you will be assigned a priority associated with those bids. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. I also wanted to remind folks here, so that we have this discussion in context, that PT wheels and LPT wheels are different than wheels scheduled with transmission ownership rights, or TORs. We have not changed the priority of TOR transactions, which still have a higher priority than either category of export or wheel that we're showing on this slide, or CAISO load. So from a bidding perspective, in addition to meeting the attestation requirements that we talked about on slide 29 when we went over the master file changes, a resource that can support a PT export needs to do the following things. They need to participate in ROK up to the PT export. They must bid in real time at least up to that PT export quantity. Their ROK schedule may be higher than just a PT export, but they need to at least cover that PT export or the ROK schedule quantity in real time. And in addition, the designated resource cannot be an energy-only resource. An energy-only resource is one that hasn't completed the deliverability study and therefore has not or cannot yet be designated as an RA resource. So for these supporting resource ROK bids, we have functionality inside of cyber called ROK RA Obligation, and we are going to be leveraging that same functionality for these situations. So it's called ROK RA Obligation, and you'll see those rules firing, but it applies whether or not these resources are actually RA. It's just that we're leveraging that built-in functionality, and that functionality will do the following things. Cyber will insert, replace, or extend the ROK RA obligation. So a resource that's been designated as a PT export has the same obligation as an RA resource with regard to ROK. Cyber will insert ROK bids if the resource has not done so, or it will replace or extend bids that were submitted so that they cover that capacity. And just like with an RA obligation, these resources capacity in ROK will be treated as $0, just like ROK capacity from an RA resource. And it will set the portion above the PT export quantity to the submitted ROK availability bid price. We have posted cyber validation rules to the application access page. I'm going to talk through some of them at a high level, but we're not going to comb through and dissect each one line by line. So if you'd like to take a look at the cyber rules in great detail, you can find them posted to the application access page using the navigation steps that are shown on this slide here. So cyber is going to validate supporting resources and set their priority in day ahead. For PT export, those are the ones that have a designated supporting resource. That supporting resource must have that flag to support the export. The resource's total supported PT export capacity will be limited to the non-RA capacity bid into the market, excluding ancillary services self-provision and awards as applicable. If the resource total supported PT export capacity is not sufficient to cover all associated PT export self-schedules, all of those self-schedules are converted to day-ahead LPT, that lower priority export self-schedule. And we've got some examples that show how this will work coming up. And then for the self-scheduled export without a designated resource, that's considered LPT export. those export schedules without a designated resource get this day-ahead LPT export priority level. Another thing that's going to occur is if we are ROK under gen infeasible in the day-ahead perspective, then the must offer obligation will apply to resource adequacy import resources in real time for those corresponding RA capacity in those trading hours where we have a ROK under generation power balance constraint relaxation. So instead of the ROK schedule, the actual must offer obligation, which does apply already in day ahead, would also apply in real time to these RA import resources in those hours where we are ROK under gen infeasible. So this is new. This is something new. You don't normally have a must offer obligation in real time if you're an RA import resource. With this change, you will have that obligation if we are ROK under gen infeasible from a day ahead perspective. So you may see inserted bids in cyber for those resources if you have not inserted or if you have not submitted bids to meet that must offer obligation. I have a couple more validation rules, and then we have the examples that we were going to talk about. There are two levels of validation that occur in real time, and we'll talk through the words on the slide, and then we'll show you an example that shows you visually how the megawatts kind of flow from one category to the next, and I think that will help provide some clarity to the written text. In order for an export to receive day-ahead PT status priority in real time, the sum of their PT exports designating the one supporting resource can't exceed that supporting resource's ROK schedule. Otherwise, all applicable exports get converted to this lower priority. And we'll show you how that works in an example. So from a Tier 1 validation perspective, again, Tier 1 and Tier 2 validation occur in real time. The supporting resource for that day-ahead export needs to be the same in real time for that Tier 1 validation piece. And in general, only one supporting resource can support, in general, one supporting resource can support multiple exports, but each export only has one type of priority, day-ahead PT or real-time PT. And we'll walk through, like I said, an example in just a couple of slides. Tier 2 validation rules look at the supporting resource, and that resource can be the same or a different resource in real time relative to what the day ahead was to get this real-time priority status. If the supporting resource is different, the self-schedule is eligible for Tier 2 validation, which is either RTPT or RTLPT status. And not to be too confusing here, but that day-ahead PT and that real-time PT priority that we're discussing are actually at the same priority level. So it's more of a just keeping track of where the priority was assigned, whether it was in real time or a day ahead. You will be notified if you are designated as a resource to support an export. This notification will occur in cyber, and it will include information, the scheduling coordinator of that export, the export resource ID, which market, and the beginning and end time. Also the scheduling coordinator of the designated resource ID, and the megawatt. There is a new process to equitably allocate transmission if we are infeasible in half. And this is in the real-time time frame. So there is a post-HASP process that will pro rata allocate available transmission capacity between CAISO load and priority wheel-through transactions if HASP cannot meet the CAISO forecast of CAISO demand or fully accommodate a priority wheel-through transaction constrained in either the import direction or path 26 north to south. So that's a little wrap up about how that works. And I also wanted to share, let's take a look at slide 49 to go over some examples. And let's see. We've got an example here on slide 49, and I'll go over this and see if we can do a good job of explaining how all of this works. Okay, so we've got an export and a generator, and along the lines you're going to kind of see how the bids are submitted, and then from both sides, on the export and the generator side. And so we've got it, and I also am getting a note here that maybe some of my numbers are wrong, so I'll go through this example the best that I can, and then James, if you want to pipe in and explain where the number discrepancy is, that would also be helpful. Essentially what we're saying here is I've got an export. I've submitted a 100 megawatt PT bid and 20 megawatt LPT. So PT is I'm indicating that I have a designated resource, and 20 LPT is without a designated resource. I've designated generator A as my resource. However, generator A is only bidding in 80 megawatts. So when we get to this column here with the IFM schedule, it says 120 megawatts is right now my IFM schedule, and the generator has 80 megawatts schedule. My priority currently, when we come look at the IFM priority, there's 80 day-ahead PT and 40 day-ahead LPT, because generator A can only cover 80. So 20 of my megawatts from this PT fall down into this LPT status. And then in ROK, we've got a schedule of 100. Now, the reason why that occurred is because in this example, ROK cut 20 megawatts of day-ahead LPT because the market was short supply. Now, before I move further in this example, James, was there a clarification that you wanted to make on this slide here?
Yeah, and I apologize because I helped come up with these examples and I missed an important point. That is that the day-ahead market bid in this example should have been 80 PT and 40 LPT. The reason being that in cyber, if the exporter tries to bid 100 megawatts of PT and its supporting resource only bids 80 megawatts, then the validation would convert all that schedule to LPT. The reason being is because you may have multiple resources using multiple exports using the same supporting resource, and we are not in a position to, if the quantity of exports exceeds what the generator can support, we're not in a position to be determining how to allocate that PT priority between the exports. And so the cyber rule will be that if the export exceeds the supporting resources bid, then it will all be converted to day-ahead LPT.
Okay.
So just pretend that day-ahead market bid is 80-40, and I apologize.
80-40. Okay, so I will fix that on these slides, and I will repost so that the example that you refer to, folks, in the future will be accurate. So what we're talking about is the first column for the day-ahead market bid from the exporter. That should have been 80 PT and 40 LPT. So I'll fix that because, as James said, we would have had a validation rule error in cyber with that, how we have it set up there. Okay, so the way it essentially flows through is then in ROK, when we had cut some of that schedule, we come out of ROK with a priority from the export perspective of 80 day-ahead PT and 20 day-ahead LPT, given the fact that we've got a generator designated to support that 80. And then in real time, we're bidding in, again, the 80 PT and the 20 LPT redesignating this generator A with that real-time market bid. And from the real-time market priority perspective, it is still maintaining this day-ahead priority level because that is when it was assigned. So then there's some questions on...
I'd be happy to answer the questions in the chat.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
This is James. So the first question, should Cyber have inserted a 20 megawatt bid for generator A? The answer is no, because the bidding for these two resources is independent. So there's no real connection to the bidding other than the exporter designates the supporting resource. The supporting resource is expected to bid what is appropriate for them. And then the second question, if we assume, let's assume that the bidder here actually did, the export bidder actually did put 100 PT and 20 LPT, and then in ISM, their priority was 120 day-ahead LPT. ROK will not change that priority. ROK will keep it. ROK in that case would actually have reduced it to 100 day-ahead LPT because the ROK is cutting 20 megawatts of the schedule. However, if it was the case that it was just an error on the bidder's part, they can firm up that in real time. They can firm up that PT schedule by if that generator continues to bid 80 megawatts in the real-time market, the exporter can submit a bid of 80 PT in real time and receive, you know, the high priority status in real time if they chose to do that. So they could firm up their PT status in real time if it was just a simple mistake. I think that's it for that example.
There was also a question on slide 46.
Slide 46. When will the notification? When does the notification go to the SC in the day-ahead market? Is this after IFM or after ROK?
Okay, I'm reading this here. This is Greg, by the way. I don't understand the question here. Slide 46, when will the notification go to the SE? I mean, in general, for cyber notifications, those will appear as kind of like rules firing. So if you submit cyber bids, and then there's some notifications that there's that you could be ineligible for high priority exports, those will show up as a cyber rule, that kind of notification. Hope that answered the question.
Oh, this is it's 47.
Oh, 47.
Okay, this is the slide we were talking about. Here we go.
Yeah, so if you can't, if the designated if the supporting resource can't support it, there'll be a warning that's given out as kind of a rule firing. Otherwise, you won't get the notification then. So it's only if you can't support it. Otherwise,
okay.
After the market closes, you'll see the final bid come in with that'll be fully the PT will be maintained as you submit it. It won't be converted.
So are these notifications right before market close, or is this after IFM or after ROK runs?
Yeah, this will be after the cyber market close. So what'll happen is if you put in a PT some type of PT self schedule and and supporting resources put their bid in, and if it can't support it, that's the only time you'll get the notification. Otherwise, everything will look good. And then once the cyber market closes, that you'll see that PT is maintained. Whatever you had submitted will be will still be a PT after the close when if you were to go ahead and retrieve your bids.
All right, and it looks like we've got a question on the phone. So Diana, do we want to go to phone questions? I think we have a little bit more discussion on this one before we move to the next example.
All right. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Noah again. So just following up on Dan's question first. So is there any type of validation from the FD that is of the supporting resource to, sort of check and say confirm with the ISO on this notification after cyber close?
So I'm not sure if this answers the question. So a supporting resource will be notified through a cyber rule that an export has been, is using that resource as a supporting resource.
And it's just a notification. There's no confirmation necessary.
That's correct. It's just you're just notified that it's being selected.
And would the notification, sorry, I think maybe it was on slide 47, include quantity? I'm checking. Okay, that's the designated megawatts. Okay, and then so on to slide 49. The question I had on the ROK was, I thought on slide 41, you talked about the cyber will insert, replace, extend ROK RA obligations. So if in this instance, if there's a 100 megawatt PT from export A, would cyber insert, extend the 80 to a 100 megawatt offer or bid?
This is James. That's a good question, but the answer is no, because this is a non-RA resource. So maybe if I go back to slide 41, I can get the context. Let's see. Oh yeah. So insert, replace, and extend the ROK RA obligation is when the PT export clears. The PT export and the supporting resource clear the the PT export clears the IFM. Then the supporting resource then has the same obligations as an RA resource to bid in ROK and also in the real time. And I think what this is saying is that the ROK will automatically submit ROK availability bids for that supporting resource to the quantity of the PT export. Is that right, Greg?
Yeah. So I think the scenario would be, say they bid the supporting resource, bids 100 megawatts. It's all non-RA, and the entire 100 megawatts is used as support. If it clears, say 50 in the IFM, there's still a $0 bid for the extra 50 megawatts in ROK. That is used to kind of as a similar to RA in that point. You're basically a supporting resource, so that there's an opportunity to clear at the full 100 megawatts in the ROK.
I see. Okay, so if at first, or I guess the first checkpoint is if the we can go back to slide 49. If the 100 megawatts does not match up to the bid in generator A, in the case it's 80, sort of the whole thing kind of fails and it gets converted in IFM priority. The entire 120 gets converted to day-ahead LPT. However, if generator A bids in 100 megawatts instead, that should clear, but and 100 megawatts would clear IFM priority, and then 20 megawatts would be LPT. But in the ROK schedule, cyber would modify any ROK bid up to that 100 megawatt in that schedule. Is that the right interpretation or timeline?
This is James. To me, that aligns with my thinking. The only thing is that if they got a 100 megawatt IFM schedule, the generator got a 100 megawatt IFM schedule to support a 100 megawatt PT. I don't know that they would be able to participate in ROK because they have no obligation to commit anything additional in ROK because it's more so for what happens, like when Greg said, when a generator gets a partial IFM schedule, partial meaning not the entire PT export quantity, then the remaining part of the missing quantity gets inserted into ROK. They must participate in ROK up to that quantity.
Okay, that's fair.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And then question, two questions, I guess. One, where might outage information from OMS come in and impact, or does it impact any part of this IFM or the priorities for the resource, and as well as what may happen or cause, maybe if there's in this example, if none of this export cleared as PT, but how does it get converted into, or what's the situation that causes it to convert into PT in the ROK priority, and does it essentially have the same, sort of high-level priority at the end of the day as IFM?
So this is James. I'll start with the second question, and I'm going to have to game this example a little bit to your question, I think. Because I think, so here would be a realistic scenario of what might happen. Let's start with the day-ahead market bid column. So these are the bids that are submitted, and we agree that if this were what was submitted, the IFM schedule would probably, actually, let's say the IFM schedule for generator A becomes 0. So they don't get an IFM schedule at all. And then the resource or the export period has 120 megawatts of LPT. Now, this resource has no obligation to participate in ROK now because they're not supporting a high priority export. However, if in the real-time market they submitted 80 megawatts of bids, and then the exporter submitted an 80 megawatt PT schedule now, that can clear at high priority status and get the same high priority as it would in the day-ahead market. And the reason is because the ROK process had, by giving that generator 0 megawatts in ROK, we basically said, okay, we don't need this generator to serve our load or our demand. And those incremental bids on top of the ROK schedule, going from 0 to 80, can be used to what we say firm up their high priority export. So those 80 megawatts that were additional to the ROK schedule can be used for high priority status in real time. I don't know if that answered every part of your question, the second part of your question, but let me know if you have anything to follow up to that.
No, I think that was helpful. Thanks for that. And then can we talk about outages, how that might play into the priorities for the exports?
Sure. I might look to Greg to see how outages are connected in CIRA, in cyber. So I don't know, Greg, do you have any response?
Yeah, so cyber, this is Greg, by the way. So cyber does not consider outages or derates in a situation where you have a resource, you're talking, I guess, a partial RA or an RA that's, somehow been, the RA is reduced on it Cyber will get the RA reduction. We are relying on the generator, though, to submit a bid only up to the point of their their outage level. So say you have a 100 megawatt resource that was, 50 megawatts of RA. So you normally would have 50 megawatts of export support. Maybe that got derated to, 75 megawatts, but the RA part got reduced to 30 megawatts. So what? That's 45 megawatts of support. So we will get the 30 megawatt RA from CIRA. We will not get the D rate, but we're expecting the resource to only bid up to 75 megawatts, thus creating the support, the 45 megawatts of potential support for any exports.
Yeah, and this is James. I just want to add that part of the outage validation rules we're trying to build in our upcoming stakeholder initiative on external load scheduling rights. So we're going to be looking at improving some of these export validation rules to prevent things like this from happening, where a resource may be on outage, but cyber doesn't have knowledge of, that supportable quantity has been reduced.
Well, I mean, I guess wouldn't you get that on generator A's IFM schedule? Right?
Well, they just need a bid. They don't need. Yeah, so the validation is comparing their bid, not their schedule. So you could have I got to doctor this example again, but if we change the generator A's day-ahead market bid to 100, that can still clear a PT export without the generator getting an IFM schedule, because we're comparing their bid to the PT quantity. Does that make sense? So even if they got no schedule, they can still support a PT export, as long as they participate in ROK for the 100 megawatts and then bid in real time for the 100 megawatts. They don't need to have any schedule. Just have the bids available to the market.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
All right, we've got another example. And should this one also be 80-40 in the bidding column for exports, James?
Yeah. So sorry.
Okay. That's okay. We'll fix that so it aligns up later. By close of business today, these slides will have a new updated date on the front, and you'll see that the day-ahead market bid from the perspective of the export is 80 PT and 40 LPT. So if you can just visualize that in your head, this example here is going to show how an export that was submitted as PT but then not rebid in the real-time market has its priority status lowered. So what we're showing you here, let me just make this a little bigger for my own self to see. Essentially, we've got an export submitting bids, identifying a certain generator. That generator's ROK schedule is not enough to cover that full ROK schedule of the export. So coming out of ROK, we have a ROK priority of 60 day-ahead PT and 40 day-ahead LPT for the export, and only 60 for the generator. However, the export, so these notifications that occur when you find out how much you've been designated and awarded and things like that, coming out of the day-ahead market results, you would get your ROK awards. And from the export perspective, you would need to rebid in real time in order to maintain this day-ahead PT status for those 60 megawatts that you could cover with that generator. If you do nothing, your ROK schedule ends up being inserted by cyber but because the export didn't rebid in and Cyber just inserts a bid, the way the Cyber does it, the bid gets inserted as a 100 megawatt PT, but that fails validation because it can't be covered by that designated generator. So that full 100 megawatts gets converted to day-ahead LPT status. So that's an example of what would occur if you do not rebid in real time. So just to, pay attention to the schedules as they come out of the day-ahead market when those market results publish, because that will essentially inform your real-time bidding requirements. Any questions on this slide?
There are no verbal questions in the queue.
All right, so those were our examples. Before we get into, I have, maybe 2 minutes of discussion with regard to market simulation. Before we get into market sim discussion, does anybody have any questions about the Cyber piece of it? All right, moving on to market sim. Just some brief updates for you here. So, of course, the purpose of Market Sim is to provide you with the ability to preview and test this new functionality from bid to bill. We have a Market Sim call today at 2 p.m., and you can dial into that to get the latest information about this particular initiative. I know that the market simulation scenarios are being developed, and they will be posted today. Oh, I just got a IM that says that they were actually published. So as of right now, you can see the market sim scenarios published to the release planning page. So that's new information. And then again, those we'll have a discussion about market sim today at 2 o'clock on the call. So those those scenarios are published. You can go ahead and take a look at that. And then before we close for today, I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any final questions as we are wrapping things up.
Quick reminder, dialing #2 will place you into the question queue, or you can please submit a written question to everyone from the drop-down menu of the chat panel.
Do we have any callers in the question queue, Diana?
There are no callers in the question queue.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for participating in today's session. I put a link in the chat to our course evaluation survey. If you would please take a moment to fill that out now, we would greatly appreciate it. I will also include this link as a follow-up in the email that I said I would send to everyone to answer a couple of these questions. Really appreciate your feedback, and, let us know how these sessions work out for you. If you would like to see something different, that's always information that we can use to improve this as we go along. So thank you to everyone for your participation, and thank you to my panelists for participating in the Q&A, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks so much.